Is it really possible to solve homelessness altogether? We'll be talking with Larry James, CEO of CitySquare, about just that on Good God coming up. Welcome to Good God. I'm George Mason, your host, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome my good friend and colleague, Larry James, to Good God.
Thanks, George. Good to be here.
Thank you. Larry is the CEO of CitySquare, a community benevolence ministry for transformation in our town that addresses remarkable issues of poverty and works with our neighbors in beautiful ways, and really a fabulous organization. Larry is a United Methodist now and a clergy person. But Larry, that's really not the whole story that people would want to know. So yeah. I'd love for you to say a few words about your own journey as coming from the Church of Christ and being a pastor and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, that's kind of laughable at some points, George, but it's interesting, I suppose. I grew up in a Church of Christ family in Richardson, Texas, when it was a very small little village north of the city. My folks were, as was the congregation we attended, a loving, benevolent, wonderful place. However, my folks never really drank the Kool-Aid of right-wing, conservative, legalistic, patternistic, Campbellite theology. But we were very involved in the church, and I had a football scholarship at Tulane University and a Harding College, rather disparate.
Yes, a little different, the two of those schools.
I followed the woman I married to Harding, and never had any intention whatsoever of being in ministry as a kid. Right. As a matter of fact, that was the furthest thing from my mind, frankly. And even now, people who knew me then are amazed that I'm a pastor. Yes. Anyway. But I fell under the influence of some really godly people at Harding, and was called to the homiletics professor's office out of class one day, and I was scared to death because I thought Dr. Jones had found out I was dipping snuff. That's how legalistic it was. But anyway, he asked me to his office. He said, "You should consider full-time ministry," and I'd never considered it before then, really. But I had a call on my life and changed my major and finished there with an undergraduate degree in religion with a minor in biblical languages.
You know, just to stop you for a moment, I think it's important every once in a while to keep reaffirming something you and I both know to be true, and that is people who sense a call to ministry usually have someone that they have admired who comes to them and deliberately singles them out and says, you know, I don't know whether you feel called to ministry or not, but I see it in you, and I think you should consider it.
Well, and that's right. And Dr. Jones and I are still in contact. He's been to Dallas a couple of times since I left there. But yeah, you're right. I think that's right. The advice and the reflection of people who mean something to you is very important in that regard. Finished there, went to Memphis for a year to do a graduate degree in the history of Christian thought, study with Dr. Harold Hazlip, who later became the president of David Lipscomb College. Really brilliant guy. We were there 3.5 years after Dr. King was murdered. Wow. And Memphis was still really a quiver, and it was an incredible experience to be there at that time. Moved then to Shreveport, Louisiana, where we served for 2 years and 45 minutes. Right. And the 45 minutes was... And one of the deacons of the church asked me in his rather palatial as Shreveport could be, I guess, office, if I thought he was going to hell because he didn't like black folks, except he used the N-word rather bitterly. And I said to him, I said, well, sir, you should really consider that question, because I can assure you of one thing. God cares more about how you answer that question than he cares about what kind of music you use on Sunday. Whoa. So that was the 45 minutes.
Yes, I get it.
I was gone. So we moved to New Orleans and finished at New Orleans Baptist Seminary, as a matter of fact. Had a job with a downtown church, 3 blocks off Canal Street. Really had 2 congregations. Right. The Sunday crowd from Tennessee and Texas, transplants to New Orleans, working in different industries, and the Monday to Saturday church, which was populated by fortune tellers and pimps and prostitutes and drug addicts and schizophrenics. And
so all the way back then, you were doing this work.
Well, it would just own me. I mean, it would just everywhere I would go, it would be there. And then, surprisingly, got a call in 1980 to come back to the home church, where I served as pastor for 14 years. But all during that time, when I came back to Richardson, I had an internal goal that I didn't share with many people. One was to make the church thoroughly and completely ecumenical.
Wow.
And to turn outward toward the community completely.
Wow.
And so for 14 years we worked that. And it was very disruptive, as you might imagine. But the church grew because every group who left, there would be 2 who would join. And it was a pretty interesting time.
Let me stop you there again and say, this is something I think for the people who are listening and watching, people don't understand always that the Church of Christ is not just the Church of Christ. These are churches of Christ.
Correct.
Therefore, sometimes people paint with a broad brush, right? And they do it with Baptists too, obviously. But each Church of Christ gets to determine its own life and mission and how it's going to, develop its work. And so yours was, though, more different than any Church of Christ I had known. Richardson East. When I first heard of you, was during the AIDS crisis in the early 90s, and you were talking about compassion to people with AIDS, and this was at a time when fear was high, and when Christians were claiming that AIDS was God's judgment on gay behavior and those sorts of things, and here was a compassionate word coming from Richardson and the Church of Christ. And then you declared the church a nuclear-free zone, which was, again, sort of a, my goodness, what's going on in Richardson for a lot of us. So that was an extraordinary gesture of how you wanted to position how the gospel was represented in your church.
Proclamation takes many forms.
Yes.
And it's best when it's intentional, I believe, and when it's rooted in a theological foundation that's steady and sure. And the compassion of God and the desire to include all God's children is powerful. And it can be disruptive, but I think pastoral responsibility involves speaking the truth with love, sometimes to power, sometimes to confusion.
Yes.
But anyway, that's what we did.
But I do think it's interesting that what I know of the Church of Christ, of course, Church of Christ and Baptists have common roots, and Church of Christ having broken off from Baptists during the Campbellite years and all, but both of them have a kind of restorationist idea of restoring the New Testament church.
Right.
And reading the New Testament in a way that says, this is that, we are they, and there's an immediacy about how we read the Bible as disciples of Jesus.
Right.
But both Baptists and Church of Christ have often departed in their actual practice from what we say, and that is that we are a grace-filled community saved by grace, and that this is God's work in our life, and that it's not what we do. And yet then there has come over time so often this way of legalistically defining who's in and who's out, not so much by grace, but by behavior. Right?
So the devil is in the details, literally.
Right.
And the test of grace is how far, how broadly one feels free to dispense it. And if you move toward that place that is unlimited and the horizon is expansive, you're in for a great ride, but also some trouble.
Yes, right.
I used to tell the church in Richardson that I was a closet Wesleyan. And that they would just have to deal with that. And I really...
Did they understand what that meant?
Probably not. So some did, but there's always been, well, not always, but there's been for a long time in my soul this recognition of this expansive grace of God that begins literally at birth.
Yes.
And proceeds all the way to the end,
Mm-hmm.
and that the goal is to strive for, in grace, perfection, which is really a noble endeavor. And Wesley was a genius,
Right.
and modeled reform and real restoration inside the Anglican Church by remaining outside it. And
Right. So here you are now finding this Wesleyan emphasis by being at home in the Methodist Church.
Exactly.
And I think that a big key in all of this, as you're describing in Wesley's understanding, is this idea of personal holiness being tied to social justice
Right.
at the same time. That the part of the problem we run into in churches is when we choose one or the other,
Right.
and not hold the two together, and that. That seems to be where the lines of American Christianity are today. Those who prefer only their sense of personal piety and then let the marketplace and let neighborhoods and let politics take care of the rest,
Right.
or those who are so passionate about social transformation that they neglect a real relationship to God that is personal and deep and holy.
Right.
Holding those two things together is really a big key, isn't it?
It really is, and in my opinion, it's the only way to walk.
Right, right. Well, I think that's part of the tension we have, and the struggle that sometimes we have with our churches, and especially in a highly partisan time now,
Right.
when so much of faith seems to be challenged by political allegiances.
Right.
Right. So when you're concerned primarily about addressing matters of the poor and the community, this sounds somehow liberal and democratic and that sort of thing, when in fact it's really about being a gospel partisan, isn't it?
It really is, and the deep rootedness of concerns for justice and equity that are found in the Hebrew Scriptures, that are then embodied and personified in the Christ
Right.
and in the community.
Right.
It's the battle to convince and to win people to that view is difficult at times, but there is reassurance in that platform upon which we stand.
Right.
And we don't have to be angry to speak the truth. Sometimes anger is appropriate.
Right.
We also don't need to avoid it completely to speak the truth, live it out. But yeah.
But I think this let's go back to the Church of Christ and Baptists as well and say there was in the book of Acts this beautiful sense of the community, the early church that had all things in common, that no one was in need. And it says that they gathered together to worship and to break bread and to pray and to care for one another's needs. And this is the vision of the church.
Absolutely.
That our traditions held up all these years, and yet it's so hard to live it in a contemporary way, isn't it?
Yes, it is, absolutely. And again, to reflect just a little bit, in Deuteronomy 15, the law of Moses says, "There shall be no poor among you if you're careful to do all the things I command you today." And that's the same paragraph in which he says also that the poor will be with you always. But that's due to the hardness of the heart of God's people. It's not due to the way things are, just by nature.
Okay, so I think we should pursue that a little more because it leads into your movement to the formation of what became CitySquare and what you're doing in the community now. Let's take a break and talk about CitySquare.
Okay, good.
One of the challenges we face in the fight against poverty is that it is such a big, broad problem that it can be overwhelming to people. Can I really make a difference? Is that something I can really impact? And the answer is yes. My name is John Seibert. I am President and Chief Operating Officer at CitySquare. The mission of CitySquare is to fight the causes and effects of poverty through service, advocacy, and friendship. The service takes the form of about 17 different programs. Advocacy takes the form of different forms of community organizing and really speaking up for neighbors in poverty. And then really the key, the secret sauce to who we are at CitySquare is friendship. CitySquare is really in the people business. And so our fight against poverty is all about relationships and investing in people. There are no clients, there are only neighbors. And we're all in this together as friends and in community as one. And so I think when we focus more on recognizing our shared humanity, that's when poverty doesn't stand a chance.
Larry, we're talking about the church's responsibility to care for the poor, and you are CEO now of CitySquare, which is a human and community development corporation that is into everything in town. I mean, it doesn't matter whether the mayor needs this for the South Dallas Grow area, whether we're talking about homelessness, whether we're talking about jobs training or whatever, education. The CitySquare is in the middle of it, and that's a beautiful thing. But how did you get into this work? How did you move from being a pastor into this community and human development work?
That's a great question. In some ways, it's a natural evolution of the opportunity of my ministry to more fully align with what I'm concerned most about. I wasn't looking to leave the church at all. As a matter of fact, we were on the verge of signing a contract with a development company to build more building. We were actually meeting Sunday school classes in neighborhood restaurants because we just had run out of room. But Central Dallas Food Pantry was started 30 years ago this year in 1988 by a fantastic couple, Jim and Betsy Sowell, who were very involved members of the Preston Road Church of Christ. And they started this food pantry. Without going into the details, in about 6 years after the beginning, things started kind of coming unglued. Wheels started coming off of the thing. And Jim Sowell was referred to me by one of my good friends, Randy Mayu. And he called me and asked if I would come and be the executive director, which was kind of just a shot out of the blue. I struggled with that for about 90 days because it was what I was told was going to make me understand it was going to be challenging. And we had so much going on at the church. Things were going well. The church is growing, as I mentioned to you before. My wife looked across the den one night at me and she said, "James, if you really believe all this stuff you've been telling us for 25 years, just take the job, see what happens." So another key
Spouse,
person.
yes.
Yeah, so
yes.
I said the next day, I called Jim and I said, "Okay, let's talk about it some more. I'm ready to go." And so I joined in the summer of 1994.
Okay.
Yeah.
So very soon after joining, I know, you came to understand that that Central Dallas Ministries at the time was doing good work, but it was doing it with a kind of approach that you realized needed a shift to happen.
Yeah.
Tell the coffee pot story.
Okay. Well, so let me first of all say I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I still don't. Never had a social work class. Taught one once, but never had one. Never had any business training except 10th grade business law.
Wow.
All my academic life was religion, humanities. My PhD work at Tulane was in American history.
Yeah.
I mean, I had so just that's the backdrop. This is a moron. So I bought a coffee pot, brand new, church type, silver plated coffee pot, and took it into the center of the interview room one morning early as we were preparing to open. And I started making a pot of coffee, and a longtime volunteer strolled over and very kindly put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Larry, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm making coffee. I like coffee. I bet you like coffee." I would expect that people who come to talk about their problems might be put at ease with the offer of a cup of coffee. And the woman said to me, very kindly, but matter-of-factly, "Don't you know that if you make coffee, these people will never leave?" And that was an awakening for me. I told my wife that night, clearly we were about a half a bubble off plum.
Right.
And that our trajectories were going to go in quite different ways eventually. And sure enough, that was the case. We solved it, and we moved into a pathway of deeper understanding, thanks to a Latina grandma.
Wow.
I was interviewing 3 families together, which is no way to do social work, I'm told. 3 wonderful moms and 5 or 6 beautiful children. These women were perfect strangers to one another. They were pooling their limited English to overcome my abject stupidity when it comes to Spanish.
Right.
We were not getting very far at all. And about the time I was ready to despair, Josefina Ortiz, who I had already interviewed, and she'd been to the grocery store to get her groceries, she came walking back through the interview room, and I stopped her. And I said, "Ma'am, could you help me?" She was shocked that I would ask her for help. That's not how the equation worked in that building. We were the ones who helped. People like her didn't help.
Right.
But I didn't know the rules, really, because I didn't know anything, right? So I asked Miss Ortiz to help me translate this conversation. She put her groceries down and gladly came to the place of assistance, and she said, I'm glad to help you. And she didn't translate any interview at all. She conducted the interview. So we were able to help these families. I'm on my knees, literally, thanking this short little grandma from Oak Cliff for her help, and not having sense enough to know what I really should have been asking from her. But she had the good sense to turn back to me when she reached the door, and she said, "You know, Larry, I could come back tomorrow if you need my help."
Wow.
And I said, "Please do." And Josefina came back tomorrow. Every day we were open virtually for 9 years.
Wow.
And that afternoon, I had a very non-Church of Christ experience. I went up into my office on the 2nd floor, looking out a plate glass window onto the street, where at that time there was a crack house across one way, a crack cocaine campground behind us, and people coming and going, getting on the buses that came by the bus stop, talking on the payphone on the corner, making drug deals, avoiding drug deals, attempting to survive. And God spoke to me. And I was not raised to hear God's voice, really. I didn't expect that God would speak to me, but God spoke to me, and God said, "Son, you are a dummy." and I said...
That's not what you want God to say to you.
I said audibly, "Yes, Lord." I really recognize that. And God said, "I don't have time to go into all the reasons why this is true. I'll give you a couple of examples." I said, "Yes, Lord." And God said, "You think you know what this neighborhood needs. You have no idea. You couldn't possibly know. And secondly, you regard everything for which I am ultimately responsible," God said, "in material terms. And that is not how to see my wealth."
Wow.
And immediately I thought of Josefina, and I thought of all the people on the sidewalks. And it was a clear call to me and to my heart that my job was to invest in God's treasure, which was found in social capital, in the lives of people who knew what was needed. And if we were going to be successful, we had to consult with them. And so we changed our whole culture in 45 days. And the fundamental thing we did was right underneath the line where it said on our interview forms, right underneath that line where it said, "Is there anything about which we could pray with you today?" We added this line, "Could you come back as a volunteer? We need your help."
Wow.
So we went from 13 to 20 in a month, suburban, white, burned out, older volunteers, good church folks, sweet people who didn't really know what they were doing either because they weren't there. We went from that group of 13 to 20 a month to about 300 volunteers a month from the community.
Wow.
Jim Sal once commented with appreciation, "James, you've got the lunatics running the asylum." And I said, "Mission accomplished."
Right.
He said, "Yeah, I get it. I get it." And the thing I heard often was, these people, Larry, are going to steal you blind.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have a response for a while, but then it occurred to me exactly what I should say. And I started telling people, "You're right. In this business, there is some theft, but it's of two kinds. It's either canned corn out the back door, sold on the street to relieve the pain and to indulge again in narcotics, or it's human decency stolen at the front door."
Wow.
I'm going with the canned corn cartel.
Yeah.
That human dignity pirates are not coming in here anymore.
Wow.
And we developed a 24/7 think tank of those 300 people, and they told us what to do. So everything we've done has come from that voice.
So this is the foundation of your book, The Wealth of the Poor.
Right.
To help people who look like us and whose experience is like us to realize that there has to be another way to look at our life together in the community.
Right.
The disparity between the material wealth and poverty of people in our communities is not the only way to look at that. That there's also a spiritual poverty that those with material wealth have, which is to say that this is where, when we get involved in so-called charitable work, there's a shift that has to happen in us, right? That what happened in your organization in employing neighbors and learning to look at them as neighbors, not clients, right? It is a shift that has to happen in the soul of the church in America today.
I agree.
That we are still segregated in so many ways, and it's not that people can't self-select in terms of racial identity, say, or ethnic identities. God can sort out all of those things in different ways, but one of the things that we don't really pay enough attention to is this economic segregation that we have, social and economic segregation. We see it in the self-selection of public schools and private schools and suburbs and urban centers and all of that, to where wealth allows you to insulate yourself from people who have less. And then you start looking at the world in a different way, don't you?
You do. And there's really hard scientific peer-reviewed research that's just coming out about the cost of segregation in Americans great cities. It's estimated that Chicago loses over $80 billion a year because of racial and economic segregation. Yes. We need each other.
Yes.
You know, we need everyone to be fully gainfully employed. When a person at the bottom does better economically, everybody does better economically.
Right. So there's a trickle-up effect.
There's
not a trickle-down.
Supply-side economics is what Mr. Bush called it. It's voodoo economics.
Right.
It doesn't work.
Right.
It exacerbates the already difficult and troublesome gap.
And this is the dilemma I think we face with, there was a time when people like William Buckley and others were committed to a kind of conservatism that was evidence-based, that was not just ideological conservatism, but said, does something have evidence that it works or not? And we had a conservative movement that always was saying, look, we're not against social change. What we're against is experimentation with no evidence that it can transform anyone.
Right.
And so let's pilot this. Let's see if this works, and then change can come. We're lacking those kinds of conservative minds today, it seems to me, that want to say, we have a real ambition here for everyone to do well.
Right.
Let's figure out how to do that.
Right. And that takes a bipartisan approach.
It does.
We have to help each other. We have to sharpen one another. We have to be open to real conversation about these issues. Right. But the religious right entered the picture after Ronald Reagan, or around the time of Ronald Reagan, and narrowed the discussion so dramatically that it created this vitriol and the sort of tests of orthodoxy. Right. And people suffered as a result.
And there's an orthodoxy of the left as well that you and I know. And this is not just about conservatism. Liberals and progressives as well have a kind of insulation to evidence-based approaches because of the need to be part of a brand identification of ideas and the like. Right. And so, the question ultimately, I think, for people of faith and those of us who are working in this arena is, how do we match up the gospel as we understand it, the desire for human flourishing in a broad way, so that everyone has a chance to experience the blessings of God and the sense of community and well-being that a neighborhood should have. And when you translate that then globally, you have a world that God intended.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Larry, for all that you do to make that possible.
Well, thank you, George.
And look forward to more conversation with you.
Yeah.
All right. Good.
One of the challenges we face in the fight against poverty is that it is such a big, broad problem that it can be overwhelming to people. Can I really make a difference? Is that something I can really impact? And the answer is yes. My name is John Seibert. I am President and Chief Operating Officer at CitySquare. The mission of CitySquare is to fight the causes and effects of poverty through service, advocacy, and friendship. The service takes the form of about 17 different programs. Advocacy takes the form of different forms of community organizing and really speaking up for neighbors in poverty. And then really the key, the secret sauce to who we are at CitySquare is friendship. CitySquare is really in the people business. And so our fight against poverty is all about relationships and investing in people. There are no clients, there are only neighbors. And we're all in this together as friends and in community as one. And so I think when we focus more on recognizing our shared humanity, that's when poverty doesn't stand a chance.